I've always been more attracted to hunting style guns though. So I have a 30-06 as well. I also have a 12 gauge too. I don't know, with the direction America seems to go, I feel like I should probably get some sort of carry-on, or not carry-on,
let's get your carry-on.
Concealed carry.
Check baggage is just not enough anymore.
Well, that's the thing, especially, and this is where the debate comes in, as Christians, and because as Americans we certainly have the right to defend ourselves, but as Christians, what sort of moral implications does that right hold?
That's where it gets interesting
with our faith.
Yeah.
It is.
I'm pretty much a pacifist when it comes to that stuff, and that, I think it partly comes from my dad.
Do you own a gun, Jacob?
No, and I don't intend to. No, I was super into them growing up, which is why I know a lot of the lingo. And,
right.
Are you recording right now, by the way?
Yeah, it's recording.
It's been recording for 20 minutes.
Yeah. So, but I can cut any of this out if we want to.
Okay.
Yeah. Should we just open the podcast and start? I forgot our script. Hold on, I gotta get the script. Hold on.
Test him.
Welcome to the Triclinium, a podcast named after the three-sided table used in the Lord's Supper, where you're invited to join the three of us as we think through matters of Christian faith, practice, and community. My name is Jacob, and I'm here with my co-hosts Nate and Eric, and we're actually in the same place, which is awesome. We're in my grandpa's
Christmas.
Merry freaking Christmas to you all.
It's a Christmas miracle. The Triclinium podcast.
Yeah. So we're hanging out, we're having fun, we're talking, and I thought we'd record a podcast. This is going to be, I think, our 20th podcast, which is kind of fun that it's like, a round number.
It was the 25th.
I know. Yeah. Currently, it's the 26th of December, so the day after Christmas.
We shouldn't have slacked so much.
I know. But anyway, and we thought we'd bring a nice, cheerful conversation to the table about Christians and firearms and what our what our approach to firearms should be. I'm recording on a new mic, so hopefully the audio is clear. I'll ask the two of you to speak up as you talk, just so that we make sure that we can gather all of it, because we're using only one microphone. But man, I'm glad to be here with you guys. So,
Likewise.
So
absolutely.
I'll probably clip in a little bit of the conversation that we were having before, because Nate and Eric were bringing up their kind of histories, their pasts with firearms and their family traditions around it. And it was some good stuff, so I'll see if I can clip that in. But
what happened to not outing anybody?
Yeah. But as a brief recap, you guys have both had some experience in your family histories, and you yourselves each own firearms, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what first got you guys into firearms? At what age did you start getting interested in it? And, around what?
Yeah, I don't even know if I could say an age, because they were always around.
Mm-hmm.
When I've hunted since I could walk. So
wow.
Yeah.
That's 3, right? 2 or 3.
That's what?
That's 2 years old.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah. When I
was out there with a gun at 2 years old.
When I was 2,
a wooden,
no joke, a wooden one. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, a wooden firearm?
Like a wooden, my grandpa cut me out a little fake wooden.
Oh, a fake. Okay, all right.
That's nice. Yeah.
I thought you were talking a Woodstock rifle.
Yeah.
What?
But yeah, because I wanted to be like my dad,
sure,
like my grandpa.
Sure.
Yeah.
So,
but yeah, ever since I was a little boy, I've always been around firearms because I've always hunted with my family. So I don't even know if I have an age. I guess 2 or 3 is probably fine. Of course, I wasn't walking long distances, actually hunting at that age, but
right. You're not in the Appalachian Mountains.
Yeah. So for me, guns were never a problem. They were just, or something that was controversial in my mind ever. It always was just there, and
right.
Dad does it, so let's do it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I've never personally had a problem with guns. I think this conversation will be interesting because I don't think I've considered like super strongly other positions on
Mhm.
whether or not Christians should own them. Obviously, this conversation will get into self-defense and things like that.
Right.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's kind of my background with guns. I've always, since I had the ability, I've shot guns myself. Like you said, I own guns personally now. So, yeah, that's kind of my background, I guess you could say, with them. Is they were just there always, and I've always used them. Use them. So.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I have a similar story. So both my grandparents were in the military, both in the Navy, I believe. And when they got out of the Navy, both of them hunted for sport, in order to bring home food on the table. And so, they were very familiar with firearms in the military and just in personal life. And both of them actually grew up hunting. My grandpa on my mother's side grew up in a very very poor family, and so they had to bring in food in different ways. I think he was one of 13 children, and my other grandpa also had to, he grew up like, well, if we don't kill, we don't eat, basically. So they're very familiar with firearms, and going into the military just reinforced that. And then afterwards, both of them started. They both have an extensive firearm collection, and my grandpa that lived near me on my mother's side, he had some property in the area around us, and so I remember vividly him driving me and my cousin down to Bi-Mart when I was probably like 8, and he bought me my first BB gun.
Oh,
and
nice.
so me and my cousin, we would go around the property. The pump, the air pump.
Yeah.
And we would go around the property and we would shoot cans and we'd shoot trees and we'd shoot whatever we want,
Squirrels.
But we weren't allowed to shoot my grandpa's squirrels and birds because he liked having them around, so we weren't allowed to kill any birds.
When you say having them around, so that he could shoot them, or
No,
could just as like a landscape?
feeder.
Yeah, no.
Nice. Okay, that's good.
Yeah, just because birds were a part of nature and he very much so respected.
He had a kind of a sanctuary there.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and when you step back and look at the whole ecosystem, you see how intricate it is and how necessary each and every part, from worms to wolves.
Right.
So, I just grew up, worked my way up from my BB gun all the way up.
Did you say from worms to wolves?
Yeah.
That would be like a good name of a book, right? From worms to wolves. Biology.
Yeah.
Something like I don't know.
That'd be a good children's book,
Right?
detailing like the food chain
Sorry,
and the animal kingdom. Yeah.
I didn't mean to interrupt you. I
No.
was like, that's kind of neat. I
Okay,
like
nobody take that idea. That's all. I'm saying. We're thinking that.
Patent pending.
Yeah. Copyright.
So yeah, I eventually graduated from my BB gun up through shotguns and rifles and all that. Like Eric, it was just a part of life. And then eventually got my own rifle and spent some time out in the woods walking around, trying to hunt. Never successfully hunted, but we definitely tried our best at it. And yeah, I mean,
Still never successfully?
no, because I haven't found an area yet to hunt in Dallas. I would love to go hunting and actually, take a deer, just for even my own.
Have you taken one here though?
No, I haven't. No,
I
Deer
might have to
virgin.
fix that.
I would love that, Eric. That would be amazing.
The next time that the Triclinium boys are all together,
Yeah.
hunting trip.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're looking at a deer now.
Yeah. Bring my mic with us. What do you think about Tom's like, oh, shoot it! Take the shot.
So yeah, I guess so both grandpas, they always had so then on my other grandpa's side, going to the range was always kind of a family event, going out and trying the different pistols and rifles and whatnot, and from 22s up through whatever I could handle. And my grandpa has a historical collection as well. I think that he has a Civil War era musket.
Oh wow.
An original too, so it's not a copy. So I guess I got kind of my reverence and respect for firearms from my grandpas. Because they saw them as tools, not
Right.
as just horrible killing machines, but as a thing to be used for a greater good. Whether that's in order to put food on the table for your family or to defend your family and yourself from whatever it may be. So, yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
I think that kind of springboards two things. I have two questions coming from there that I think can get the conversation open.
Yeah.
So number one, like I kind of mentioned, is I think when we talk about guns, we have to talk about self-defense. But then the other side of that is, like, even if we were saying that you can't use guns for self-defense, does that mean guns shouldn't exist from the Christian perspective at all? Meaning, take Nate's grandparents, for example. Like, is it cool for a Christian to own a gun for the purpose of hunting, for literally providing for one's family?
Yeah. So like it would be a pretty extreme case for somebody to say
correct
something like, not only should Christians like not be into self-defense, but they shouldn't own guns at all ever. Like in any case, that would be a pretty extreme.
I feel like
it's a good line to draw. Right? Like,
correct.
Okay, this is.
I feel like that would be the extreme pacifist version. Of it.
Yeah.
So, Jacob, you mentioned previously that you are well, would you call yourself a pacifist?
I would say I'm a nuanced pacifist.
Okay.
So it's not legalistic, but I lean that way.
I kind of want to go the self-defense route first because you piqued my curiosity earlier. So, so biblically speaking, when we're thinking about self-defense, I think for most people, the passage I think it's in a couple of the gospel accounts where, I think it's in all of the gospel accounts if I remember right. It's revealed in, I want to say it's Luke, that Peter cuts off the ear. Of
take to yourselves 2 swords.
Yeah,
go and buy 2 swords, right?
Correct. Yeah, Jesus urges the disciples to buy 2 swords, seemingly for the purpose of self-defense. But I actually was referencing just beyond that, where Peter cuts off the ear of folks who are coming to arrest Christ, and came in the night, a big mob, big crowd, and it's which, side note, is strange that like some of the gospels like mask who that person was. They don't say his name, but then one of them say it's Peter. Cuts off the ear of an impending attacker, I guess you could say. So
the high priest's servant.
So I just wanted to bring that up and get your thoughts on it. Since I think it's relevant to the conversation.
I think when we think of self-defense, I think it's unwise to create a rule around it, because no rule can encapsulate the complexity of a situation. So like, I think like one of the best examples of this is like Bonhoeffer was I think maybe not a pacifist, like a full-on pacifist, but he definitely saw killing another human being as like almost always morally wrong. Yet he was willing to aid a plot to assassinate Hitler. He himself was never going to be the one to pull the trigger or do anything like that, but he at least was willing to aid the rebellion, right? That would have probably, that like the end would have hopefully been the death of Hitler, right?
Right. The analogy would probably be like he put the gun in somebody else's hand.
Yeah. I mean, even looser than that, but yes,
definitely, and that's the boiled down version. But he was aiding that process.
Yes, and he had to walk through that.
I don't want to get too far off that topic. Just, I want to ask a quick sidebar question.
Sure.
Do you think Bonhoeffer actively thought about that he was aiding the death of Hitler?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, okay. I think so.
Yeah, I haven't read much Bonhoeffer, so.
Yeah, no.
The way he talks about it, the duty that he saw that he had, because he came to America and studied with, I think he was in a monastery, wasn't he?
No, he studied at Union in New York, I believe. Though that period of his life, I read the biography, and it's just been a long time.
And I think the reason why I remember it that way is because I remember it being a pivotal point, because I think that there was somebody in his life, and he was considering becoming full-on pacifist, but he saw what was happening to his people in Europe,
okay.
And so it was an extreme dichotomy for him.
Yeah.
Do I go and help aid this?
Right.
This act of violence almost, or do I reject that and become,
Yeah.
peaceful beyond all means, or beyond,
Right.
to the core.
Right. And regardless of whether or not that was like a pronounced, a recorded thing for him. Because I know that Metaxas, you probably read Metaxas's biography,
I
yeah?
believe so, yeah.
Metaxas, let's say, he stretches the truth in some certain areas around the biography. He's been lambasted by Bonhoeffer scholars because of that. But that's all besides the point. Regardless of how recorded that was, you have to believe that somebody who wrote an entire book on ethics had some, question marks around his willingness. Especially, I think, his willingness to lie, because there was a lot of lying that was going on, because he was trying to maintain that he was pro the Reich, right, the Third Reich, and or at least not like horribly opposed to it, so that he could get deeper into the regime. So, anyways, but
I gotta read some Bonhoeffer, man.
oh, dude,
Oh,
yes,
it's so good.
when you're ready, hit me
we
up.
read a bit for
Not just Life
Praxis,
Together.
correct?
Yeah, we read Life Together. Yeah,
But not just Life Together. His other,
yeah, he's
Yeah.
The
sauce.
Cost of Discipleship
That's too
is
bad.
excellent.
I know.
It's one of the best books I've read.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
I saw it on the shelves.
Costly grace. The idea of costly grace was,
That was
changed
for-
how I viewed it.
That was a different Anderson class. That
Yeah.
Costly Grace we had to read, correct?
Oh yeah, there's like a
the-
chapter for it. Yeah,
the book was The Cost of Discipleship by Bonhoeffer.
Oh, that's right.
So,
Yeah.
but the idea of costly grace
it's
comes
in the
from
first
that.
a couple
Yeah,
chapters.
right.
But the funny thing is that Bonhoeffer then I know we're on a rabbit trail. You got me talking about Bonhoeffer, now I'm all excited. He goes on to say that the cost of discipleship was like basically a futile exercise of trying to become righteous by his own eyes, and he goes on to basically disavow the word. So if you read Ethics, that's his later take on how to live as a responsible Christian. It's a very fascinating approach to morality, but and actually it'll come up as we talk about this conversation, because that's informed me.
Yeah. He is amazing.
I'd have to go and find my sources again for that. I'd like to go and read some more biographies before I would be ready to talk again.
Anyways, let's
Yeah,
get
sorry,
back.
Let's go back. Let's go back.
So,
So in that case, I think almost everybody would say, whether or not you believe that Bonhoeffer was right or wrong in allowing himself to go that far, it's understandable that he would take that approach, right? Like it's gut level understandable, right? And so I think to say
just to clarify, what approach?
the willingness to aid an attempt to assassinate.
And I think to elaborate just a bit more on that, it's like, as humans, I think we can sympathize with Bonhoeffer in that situation, because if we were faced with the same evil, I think that we would justify our own action against that evil as well. So we can sympathize with him in that we understand why he did what he did.
Yeah.
Is that what,
Yeah, absolutely. So the sympathy tells us, I think, that there's at least some sort of our ideal in our head that Bonhoeffer would have met, which is the protection of the Jews, right? And I think that's worth thinking about. I don't know that is the only factor that we should consider, and that's where I would say there are times where I think self-defense is not the ethical move. And I think there are times where self-defense is the ethical move. Mm-hmm. And I really do think it boils down to to our best judgment, whether or not we believe that if we were in their shoes, and this is going to get complicated, if we were in their shoes, if we were committing the evil that this person was about to commit, would it be better for us to die or for us to be given a chance again? And I think in most cases that means, so for instance, someone breaks into your home and you're not sure that they're there for violent means, right? For any violent purpose. In that case, I would say, there's some people that would say, your property, your home, you don't know what's going on with that person, shoot, right? Now that's a pretty extreme position in and of itself. However, I would say in that case, you might think to yourself, this is just some kid that doesn't know what they're doing, right? And if I was in this person's shoes, I would want to be given a second chance. If I was committing a genocide, though, knowing what I know now, knowing Christ, if I was committing a genocide, I would want someone to stop me by any means necessary. So that's where it gets into like this is where you have to use judgment and discernment and the sad thing about self-defense is in a lot of cases it's such a quick judgment that has to be made that you can't necessarily go through all of the logic. So that's where the sympathy comes back in of like, listen, if I let's say I have a wife and kids and someone busts into my house, I'm not going to start doing some ethical math to try to figure out if this is permissible.
That's why I was a little.
Right.
I was afraid you were going there.
Yeah.
I think that begs this conversation even more because in the moment you don't have time to know where you stand on these issues. So you do have to come to terms with the fact that this situation might happen to you, and what are you going to do in response to it?
Yeah.
So I think it's important for people to have this conversation even with themselves and with their family.
Yeah.
So let me back up a bit so I can make sure I'm understanding you.
Sure.
Because originally you said that you don't think there should be a rule around self-defense. I want you to clarify that statement. Like, because I almost feel like you went in a different direction than what you meant by that.
I think that, like, when I say there shouldn't be a rule around self-defense, I mean that it shouldn't be binary in the sense of, like, you either say, as Christians, we have no right to self-defense, or as Christians, we always have the right to self-defense.
Okay.
Like, I think there needs to be nuance and discernment.
Essentially saying it's complicated and there are a lot of
It's complicated,
areas.
yeah. There's no, like, I would even say the situation of a single person and a person who has a family are different situations ethically, and that they almost would warrant completely different chapters in a book on how to approach self-defense, right?
Yeah.
If you're single, you can risk your life a lot quicker and be looser with it, right? If you have your life is the wall.
I was going to say, I'm sitting here thinking I can't imagine a scenario in which somebody busts into my house that I don't immediately feel as though I have a right to self-defense because of my family now. I have Leah and Briar.
In the eyes of society as well.
Correct, yeah. But I don't really care about what society thinks. I care about what Scripture has to say about it.
Yeah.
So,
and I think there's another level to this where... So this gets into Bonhoeffer's theory of ethics, which is that there is a law as to how Christians ought to live. And that Christ gives us these like very broad sweeping principles. But that the heart of the law is to take on the burden of your neighbor on yourself. And that is so he calls it vicarious representative action, which is so you do something so that someone else doesn't have to face the weight that you do, whatever that weight might be, right? So this is how, like he will say things like, or he would probably go so far as to say, in the instance of someone breaking into your home, if you decide to shoot the person that's coming in or kill them in whatever way you have the ability to do so, what you're actually doing is you're taking the burden of guilt onto yourself rather than either your family or some police officer in the future or whatever, right? You're actually pulling that guilt onto yourself, and that there are times where pulling guilt onto yourself is the loving thing. So this is his, like, in there are ethicists all over the place that would dispute Bonhoeffer. So like this is a very novel approach to ethics. But he would say there are times where sin is the right thing because of love, but only because of love. It can never be for selfish intent, right? It's not like I get to steal and I get the bread and that's why, like I steal for my own self and that's justified. But it's like if you have a family who's starving and you steal, you've done the loving thing. You have sinned, and you've done the loving thing. You've fulfilled the law, even though you've sinned. And so there's like this weird, right, or like you've lied to the Nazis, right? Yeah. And I think that what I like about that approach is that it allows for all the things that we by instinct know are right, but we can't find a principle that justifies them, right? So like the Kantian principle of like somebody comes to your door and they're like, hey, someone's chasing me. It's your friend. Someone's chasing me. They're trying to kill me, and the person comes after them, and this person's hiding in your house, And you know, Kant basically says if you lie to that person, you've committed an evil, because if that person, this is a terrible justification, but he says if that person then goes outside, like leaves your apartment, and your friend has tried to escape out the back window, they will die, and it was because you lied. And it's like, well, that's ridiculous, right? And so like we all know that lying to the Nazis is the right thing to do. Like I think that's like just inherent in us. But we also know that lying is wrong. And that's also inherent in us. And I think what Bonhoeffer's approach allows for is a complexity where these two things actually are held in tension with each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So anyways,
that is all interesting, yeah. I don't think I care for that approach, but
I understand.
yeah,
Most people don't.
I'd have to read some Bonhoeffer. I'm sympathetic towards it, and I get it. I think I'm in a different ethical place than where I would go with that. To use your example for, Nazis are knocking on the door. I think of, have you seen the movie Inglourious Bastards before?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, there's the scene in the beginning where Hans Landa in the SS knocking on the door, and they're coming looking for Jewish families, and the character in the house has to make the decision: am I going to actively hide the Jewish family that I'm already hiding, or am I going to give them up for the sake of my family, who the SS officer is threatening?
Beautiful ethical conundrum there,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Like well painted.
Really gets you thinking on that one for sure. But yeah, I'm not sure I want to go too far down this road because I think
But for me, if you want to understand my approach to any of this, that's a key to it.
No, it is. Yeah.
So that's all. That's why I bring it up.
Yeah.
In all of this, that will be my
for sure.
The interesting part with that, what you said is that it allows for that that moral, or not moral, but basically that gray area that allows us to do what's right in our hearts, but that we can't find a justification for.
Yeah.
Essentially.
Yeah.
The flip side of that is that it also opens the door for people to manipulate the rules in their favor to commit evil, which is probably where people would argue against it. But
the only rule in the ethic is that it's vicarious representative action. So it is always for the sake of the neighbor.
Yeah.
If you're doing it for yourself, then you're already stepped into the wrongs, right?
Right, and I understand that, but
people can read it that way for sure, and that's I think the biggest thing is like
I think that would be a big critic of it.
It's a huge part of the criticism.
Yeah. I'll say one last thing. I kind of want to veer back more towards self-defense specifically, but I'm sympathetic towards Bonhoeffer's position, I think, in principle, and I think I probably land somewhere similar to that. I think there's a language barrier in how Bonhoeffer might approach it, and I might, because I would not call telling the Nazis that I don't have Jews in my house lying. And I think there's actually decent biblical precedent for that.
Interesting. How do you? I understand the biblical precedent of there are certain times where lying is seen as justified, but I don't know how you don't call it lying.
There's most people will bring up the cases of like oh my goodness, I'm forgetting her name. Who hid the Israelite?
Oh, Rahab.
Thank you. Goodness. Most people will bring that up as a justified case to be able to lie to somebody because it's there, biblically speaking. Some will say that Rahab was wrong, but God used that as a part of His plan to establish Israel. The most interesting, and this was brought up in my ethics class actually. The most interesting one I found regarding lying is Psalm 52. And what happens in Psalm 52 is that David is commenting on an event that happens, I believe, in 2 Samuel, I want to say it is, where it's like Doeg the Edomite or something like that. Tattles on where David's location is to Saul, and what he says in the psalm is that Doeg was a liar and full of deceit. In that case, You can look it up. I'm pretty
Interesting.
sure,
Okay.
yeah.
All right. I'm fascinated now. You've piqued
very
my interest.
interesting. And so, kind of what happened in the ethics class and how we were discussing it, I think the principle of what was being discussed is that sometimes people aren't deserving of the truth, and even though we're telling them something that may not have truthful facts in it, it's more deception than it would be lies, and it's a justified deception. And in that case, it wouldn't be sin. So, like, what rubs me the wrong way with what you were saying about Bonhoeffer is that he's saying sometimes there's justifiable sin. And I would just say that I don't think you have to say that. I think that there's precedent with that psalm, from what I can tell, to where it's actually, you know, we might call it a lie or deception just because that seems to be the language there. But, like, the essence of the psalm seems to say that some people aren't deserving of the truth. In that case, Doeg, the Edomite, was prohibiting the greater plan of God, which was that David would become the next king in line for Israel. So
it sounds like I think I've.
Is that all making sense?
Yeah. There's a
it gets
point
real
where,
complicated, but
I've heard before that, like, kind of a nuanced Kantian approach would be that there are certain people that have what's the right word? Forfeited their right
to the truth. Yes. The Nazis being the example.
Right.
Yeah.
And my big question would be, then you have to have an arbiter. Someone gets to decide when someone has crossed that barrier.
Yeah.
And who is that? Who is the arbiter? Who gets to decide?
Yeah, I think it's just it has to come down to personal opinion at the end of that, I would think. I'm not sure how you get around that.
So the key problem there, I think, is that it makes man into the judge and the arbiter, right? Whereas Bonhoeffer's approach, basically, he starts out ethics by saying, no man will escape this life without sin, so we should. That's not our intent. It's not.
So we should sin sometimes?
It's not that. It's that we shouldn't run away from it as if it's the main problem. The main problem is love and whether or not we are loving individuals, right? So then there would be some people that would say, well, listen, if you're loving your neighbor, then whatever you're doing is not sin. And Bonhoeffer would say you can sin and also love your neighbor at the same time. And when he says sin, he means very quite literally like the breaking of the law, right? The specific statutes. So this is where, like, I would say, this is what I think happens with Jesus in the Sabbath. I think Jesus transcends the laws and breaks a statute, and I don't think that he minds. And here's why I say that. The Pharisees say to him, you're healing on the Sabbath. Like, there's all these other days that you could be doing this. Why are you doing this, right? And his response is never based around the law. He never says, I'm healing on the Sabbath, and it's not really work because X, Y, and Z. He doesn't give them, like, some sort of logicked out. He says, he appeals to love. That's his first thing, is he goes, you would pull an animal out of a ditch, right? You love your animals. You can see a reason why you would break a law for an animal. I'm doing it with a person, and you won't. So basically, he calls out hypocrisy, right? Yeah. So in that, I think what he's doing there is pulling out ordered love or disordered love. He's saying you love an animal more than you love a person. What's wrong with you, right? But I think it's telling that he doesn't say, well, here's my like logicked out approach to why I didn't break the law. He doesn't seem concerned about it because Jesus knew that he was fulfilling the law at its core, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's an interesting argument. I have some things in response, but I feel like I want to go back to self-defense.
That's fine. Let's go back to self-defense.
It's very. I'll leave it at this. The topic around, like, I think an encapsulating, like, phrase around that is, like, is lying ever justified, is an interesting one. I think there's just a lot of language barriers in it. I think most people are saying
But
at
cross
least
wires.
pretty close to the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same results a lot of the time.
Yeah. It's just like to kind of lay my cards on the table. I guess is I want to protect against saying that sin is justified in any case.
Sure. And I don't think Bonhoeffer is saying that sin is justified.
Yeah.
I think he's saying it's unavoidable.
Inevitable.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
I get that. It's a language problem for me, and I feel
Sure.
that could be a whole nother
And
discussion that
I
would be
also-
interesting to work out. But I would have a problem with some of that language.
I also very well could be misrepresenting Bonhoeffer because I read Ethics once and missed them, and I think there were several chapters that I just didn't understand at all because he's too smart for me. So if any of you who are listening, I doubt it, but if any of you are like complete Barth scholars and Bonhoeffer scholars, and you're like, this is ridiculous,
Let us know.
yeah, email me because I would love to know if I'm wrong because I don't want to tell more people that. So.
Yeah.
There you go.
So to put a summarizing cap on kind of what we were just saying right there, that kind of got nuanced and complex.
It certainly did.
What we were saying is that self-defense isn't as cut and dry as people think it is.
Right.
Life is complicated, situations are complicated, and therefore the application of self-defense is complicated.
It's hard to have one rule that spans across every circumstance and every available instance.
And I think personally I can agree with that. I thought you brought up an interesting point about singles versus those who might have families.
Right.
Might have a different approach to it. At the end of the day, I think there is a justification for self-defense. I'll just take the example of myself with my family as an example. I think most cases, if somebody is trying to harm my family or something like that, seemingly, that is, that I would be justified in defending my family. I think you and I might just have different ways of explaining that via language like we just got into, but at the end of the day I think it doesn't seem like either of us are against self-defense per se.
But let me ask a question that might get to an interesting undershadow of all this, which is we always talk about whether or not we have the right to self-defense. If you defended yourself and you now are responsible for the death of another human being, do you believe that you would walk through life without that haunting you?
Oh, absolutely not. Yeah. No.
So what is that? Let's dig into that because that has to get brought up at some point. What is it? What is it that makes us feel bad? Is the real question, right?
Well, I think that probably just has to do with human finitude and our inability to see the entirety of a situation as God can in His omniscience. So we're always going to be second guessing our personal judgments of different scenarios because it's not just whether or not I murdered a guy and I feel bad about it. You can apply that to any ethical situation, and you're constantly going to question yourself: did I make the right decision? Did I do the right thing? Did I fall into sin? Did I do something that was justified or not? And so I think I would imagine that's just a condition of human beings having a sinful nature to them.
Do you think that there's no guilt involved? So somebody comes into your house. Okay, so you would say clear guilt, or meaning cleared of all guilt. That would be like if you
logically, I think you kind of have to say that, do you not?
I would say you can't.
No guilt.
I would say that there is no.
Maybe I'm misunderstanding.
There is no killing of a person in which guilt is not at some point levied, right? But then again, remember, I see sin and like the breaking of certain laws that there are certain laws that it seems to be that most cultures just feel right at a deep level.
I think there's been particular cultures where there's people who kill like entire nations and feel as though there's nothing wrong with it.
That's true. That's a fair point.
Even warrior cultures are celebrated in certain parts of the world, and even Aztecs and Mayans sacrificed people.
Sure.
That's just straight up.
I was thinking
murder,
more along the
ritual
lines of the
sacrifice.
Amalekites sacrificing children to Molech.
So, I guess it's more the. I think there is no, like I said, like Bonhoeffer said, I think there's no way that we escape this world without some sense of guilt. And that means that guilt doesn't necessarily it shouldn't act as the prime motivator for our decision making. Because we will feel
Expand
guilt
on that a little bit more.
We will feel guilt over certain things.
Right. So I think here's where it might be getting crossed, is because we're trying to talk in the particular situation of self-defense, but I think some people genuinely feel justified in self-defense, and so perhaps that's where guilt may not be involved there, but those people might feel guilty or condemned in other parts of their life.
Sure.
So to your point, in I believe Bonhoeffer, there's no escaping this life without guilt,
Mm-hmm.
and so on a broader sense, I think that's true, but on a smaller sense in self-defense, I think some people genuinely believe, no, I had every right, I was justified, and it was correct for me to defend my family against a home invader or against somebody who was causing somebody else harm or whatever it may be.
Mm-hmm.
They feel that justification of it. But so I think Jacob was asking. I think you're kind of going between the particular and the universal.
Why is it that many people who will shoot a home invader will feel guilt over it in the future?
Yeah.
Should they feel guilt over
even
it?
though they may have been entirely justified to do so?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So that's the question.
Yeah. Perhaps the answer to that is is the Imago Dei itself, that
Mm-hmm.
human beings possess a particular status, if you will.
For Christians, definitely.
Yeah.
I think that's absolutely a part of Christian consideration.
Well, everybody contains
Sure.
the Imago Dei, so I think on some level it's at least reasonable to think that human beings, when a life is taken, are inevitably going to have some sort of reaction because of God's imbuing them.
Like a
with that.
mournful reaction, or
Mhm.
like it's sad that happened. Is that what you're
Yeah,
saying?
yeah.
Mm.
Anytime another human being dies, I think there's a particular reaction because God made it that way.
Mm-hmm.
I think that could be the answer. My answer. To
I think that's a part of it. I think that I think you hit it too. At least something that I would probably feel, if I were in that situation, is if I did something wrong, and a part of that goes into Imago Dei, and then the part that's under that, the guilty conscience, is like, am I still saved? Essentially,
Right.
So underneath the guilt is like, oh,
The fear.
right. It,
Um,
right, the fear of whatever it may be leads you to feeling guilty.
Mm-hmm.
So I think at the root of it is fear, and fear of different things. Somebody who's not a Christian may fear whatever. They fear that they did wrong, and that who knows, they snuffed out somebody's torch before.
You don't think it could be the other way around?
That fear leads to guilt, or guilt leads to fear.
Yeah. I think you were saying fear leads to guilt.
No, sorry. I was trying to clarify that underneath guilt lies fear. So somebody may feel guilt about defending their family, but underneath that guilty feeling is a feeling of fear that they're unreconciled with God now.
Yeah, there's a brokenness
Right.
that they saw in themselves that they're afraid of, right? That
Sure.
could lead to.
Right. The brokenness of the world becomes very clear in a situation like in a self-defense situation. So I think that underlies that guilty feeling, and that fear manifests itself as guilt and as kind of a pointing down to oneself and saying, oh, you're wrong, you're bad, you're this, you're that, you're guilty, you're condemned, because you cause this brokenness. And what does that lead to ultimately?
That's actually a really good. So here's a question, and this I'm fairly sensitive, so it could be that's just the case with this one. Have you guys ever watched a war movie and felt a genuine sense of unease and discomfort at the end of it?
I just did the other week. Yeah.
Okay, all right. So I'm not alone in that.
I
No,
watched
definitely.
All Quiet on the Western Front. Have you seen that one?
Oh, have I?
The newer. Well,
I don't
the newer.
think I
I
have.
haven't seen the newer
I
one.
haven't seen that one yet.
Have you seen the older?
Actually, no, I haven't seen that at all.
So, I guess just to give a quick cap
Yeah,
of what
yeah.
it is, it's actually it's a World War I movie.
Mhm.
World War I movie from the perspective of a German soldier and his experience along with his friends. To make a long story short, he goes in very patriotic, I guess.
Yeah.
Nationalistic, I guess you could say.
Mhm.
Proud of his country. Feeling as though he's a part of a grand generation of German people.
Mm-hmm.
And as time goes on, he loses every single one of his friends. The meta narrative is that the war is pointless and people are dying for no reason. And by the end of it, finally, people realize that, and the war is coming to an end, and he dies 2 seconds before the war ends. And so it's kind of like supposed to show that it was all pointless.
That horrible sense of tragedy.
But anyways, really, like, I'm sure accurate and horrific scenes in the movie.
Yeah.
And it moves you. Yeah. And it gives you a really disgusted taste. By the end of the movie.
So it could be then, Nate, that just like you were saying, like when we take the life of another person, it's like that times 1,000, because now it's so up close and personal. There's that trauma, and not only that, right? I did that, and even if the reasoning is there to, like, you know, and you feel justified as far as ethical guidelines and legal guidelines go, there's this feeling of like, I contributed. Though it was justifiable, I contributed to the disgusting nature of violence, and
not only that, but the literal decimation of something that God created.
Yes.
Yeah, that too.
Yeah. So maybe that's what's going on there, because I was trying to think of an example where guilt or something like that, kind of that deep inner, like, I'm unshook by that, right?
Yeah, right.
Can happen in a setting where that actually didn't happen. I didn't do anything. I just watched the movie, right? I'm experiencing this secondhand. I'm watching someone else do this stuff.
Yeah.
And just someone else doing it sets me on that same edge of like, oh, you know, it kind of makes my chest tight, right?
Right.
So maybe that you know, to get rid of the, you know, the experiential side of that. But I think I don't believe at the end of all things that there's any way of killing besides like by like demand of God, right? I don't think there are any situations where killing doesn't lead to some level of guilt. I think that there's something endemic to killing.
For the Christian or just for anybody?
For anybody, but I think for Christians specifically need to be aware of it, right?
Yeah.
Because we're those who
maybe
are
maybe a
holders of
better
the
way
law.
to say it is Christians to a larger degree, because I don't know, it feels like there's some that's an awful subjective way of putting it. I feel like there has to be some people out there who feel no degree of guilt.
No, and I'm not saying I've escaped the feeling. So you could say that there's the two realities of guilt. There's the guilt of like the metaphysical guilt, right? Like our relationship to creation and the disruption therein, right? And our relationship to God, right? And then there's you could say there's the natural, and then there's like what we experience, and those aren't always the same, right? So like you could have a psychopath who violates the laws of nature, you know, however you want to call it, and then feels no guilt, right? And then you can have somebody who is just overly sensitive in their conscience and does nothing to do any breaking of any laws, and they still feel some sort of guilt, right? All the time, and so like almost breaking the experiential, the feelings off for a second. I think that naturally, I don't really like the terms of nature and like natural law or anything like that, but as far as I could see your face kind of twist when I said that, there's some form of reality in which guilt is inescapable in those situations. Like I don't think that there's like we can it's almost it's an ontological guilt, like a guilt of being. Like it's beyond what any like external structures could impose on us, right? So we could say it's legal and we think biblically it's reasonable, right? but then if we get to the like, there's a certain point where it's like, but at the level of being, there's something disrupted and broken.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I would agree with that.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
Well,
despite my, I think, correct me if I'm wrong. This is what you're saying is, despite my at least theoretical justification of self-defense and possibly taking another life,
right.
underneath that was never the ideal in the first place. That idea. It's because of sin and brokenness, and actually that very action points to a further brokenness of the world and the need for reconciliation.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so what I was just going to say too is the
Yeah, I
flip
would
side
totally
of
agree with
guilt
that.
is that ultimately it can be used by the Spirit to point you back towards God and the need for reconciliation.
Right.
You know, because somebody may be justified in a self-defense situation and still feel guilty about it, and that can be good
Mhm.
because it leads them back to Christ and it leads them back to forgiveness and love and reconciliation,
Yeah.
even for the one who hurt them. So
Yeah.
you know,
Conviction
even,
isn't meant to be a final. Yeah, it's an indicator back to.
right. Even somebody who
Repentance.
fails in a self-defense situation, so that somebody may have the means or may be capable to defend them and their family, and they could fail. You know, and they feel guilty because they failed. So that guilt,
Yeah.
that guilt still leads them to
That's an interesting take. Yeah.
faith,
We don't
love,
talk about
forgiveness.
that very often, do we?
No, we don't.
The feeling that you would get if you had the gun and decided not to shoot,
Or yeah, or
or
even-
couldn't get it out of the lockbox,
right?
or whatever.
Or you get bonked on the head with glass and you are unconscious and whatever
Yeah.
happens. So,
Yeah. And that isn't necessarily a legal form of guilt. It goes deeper, right?
Exactly.
It's like it goes back to what you were talking about, the finitude, right? It's the feeling of being in a world where evil has a reign of its own,
Mhm.
right?
Right, and the guilt in that situation, you know, you feel guilty because I think anybody who is in that situation would be like, man, why didn't I do that? You know,
Right.
but that guilt still leads you to back to the cross ultimately.
Yeah.
And the need for reconciliation and the need for Christ. But the other way of that guilt is into shame
Yeah.
and is into is a retreat into yourself and you know whatever else that may lead into, you know, away from love.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, actually, I watched another movie that I think so along the lines of that.
I love movies.
Another particularly horrific movie. I'm not sure I would recommend this one, but
Yeah.
it's called Wind River. Have you ever watched that one?
Wing River.
Wind River.
Wind
With
River.
Jeremy Renner.
Correct.
I've seen it on Netflix. I
Okay.
haven't actually seen it.
I mean, you can watch
Sorry.
it. It's pretty gruesome. A lot of very bad things in it. I won't say more than that.
Okay.
But essentially, the main character in the movie, he's a hunter. He tracks predators and removes them for farmers and things like that in Wyoming. And he comes across a murder case while he's out on just walking around. He finds a body, and as he goes on, he figures out that it was his daughter's best friend who was killed, and it happened in the same way that his daughter was killed.
Ooh,
And
sounds like a good story.
yeah, at the end of the day, what happens with him, it's not really revealed too much about what happened to his daughter, but we know that his daughter was killed by a group of men likely, and abused in certain ways
Yeah.
as well. And he feels a tremendous amount of guilt for not protecting his daughter.
Mm-hmm.
He allowed his daughter to be home alone, and she threw a party that got out of hand. And so,
Got it. Okay. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I feel like that's in track with what you're saying. It's on the flip side. He feels shame and guilt
Right.
from
Yeah.
his community for not protecting his daughter.
Right.
Right.
And so, you know, same result is if, you know, let's say he was there and was able to commit an act of self-defense for his daughter, but he didn't do anything, and he couldn't do anything, and he feels the same guilt that he likely would have, just in a different way, had he have been there and done something.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Where that turns
So-
into, I think where that guilt and shame turns into sin is when it manifests itself in revenge.
Yes.
So I think that oftentimes in movies or whatever, we almost celebrate or look up to the men that seek vengeance, on the people that hurt them, like Taken.
Batman.
Yeah, Batman. Exactly.
I love Batman.
Ultimately, that becomes you're elevating yourself to the point of judge, and you're allowing yourself to enact justice and taking that out of the hands of God. Ultimately,
Batman's an interesting case, though. But
yeah.
But isn't there a form of judgment also when you are in the situation when somebody breaks into your home? Don't you become the judge, jury, and executioner in a brief moment?
Yeah.
I feel like we're wanting to preserve the ability for God to judge ultimately in these scenarios, but I feel like that ignores the fact that we still have personal responsibility and make decisions in real time.
Well, so that's the other thing. In that situation, so in a self-defense situation, are you becoming the judge, jury, executioner? Potentially against somebody else who has declared themselves judge, jury, and executioner as well. So you're not on an uneven playing field.
No. But in the instance of vengeance, you're just doing that with somebody who in the past has been judge, jury, and executioner, right?
In the case of vengeance, yes. I was speaking more in the realm of self-defense.
Right.
Well, what I'm saying is I think that vengeance and self-defense are not far from one another, and that's what makes me weary.
Perhaps. Yeah.
I think...
Well, one is a response and one is taking action.
Right.
So they're not the same.
Let's go back to where we started.
Yeah.
Let's go back to where we started.
Yeah,
what do you think... Why was Christ against Peter taking up the sword?
Yeah, that's a good point.
And beyond that, I think even farther beyond that, why weren't the Christian communities that spawned out of it opposed to martyrdom? If self-defense is a prominent feature of
why
Christian
weren't they
ethics.
opposed to martyrdom?
Yeah, why would they not have fought tooth and nail to maintain themselves? Because in Islam, self-defense is no problem, right? And it's actually like a very righteous thing to do. So there's something about the Christian message where we actually think that there's something about martyrdom or allowing the world to act as judge, jury, and executioner over us, just as it did with Christ, that is fitting for us.
Yeah. I don't want to get into Islam and outside views.
Sure, and that's just speculation.
And we don't have to.
Yeah. My quick response or initial thoughts, I don't think I've ever been asked this question, so I'm kind of thinking on the fly.
Sure.
But why was Christ against Peter taking up the sword? Well, because he was predestined to go to the cross. He had a greater mission at hand, and so self-defense wasn't the...
Are we not?
Sorry, go ahead.
Are we not predestined towards the cross? In a different form, but are we not called the same direction?
Yeah, that's a good question.
I think you could also look, though, to... it's not exactly self-defense, but Christ removing himself from situations in which he would have been stoned or...
Sure.
He would have been condemned in the square.
Yeah.
And
that's
Paul,
where I was going next.
Paul appeals to his citizenship to get a lighter sentence, right?
Right. Which is a form of self-defense. In Paul's case, more in a lawful manner, but in Christ, he removed himself from the situation.
Totally. Yeah.
And he didn't take a life in that respect.
No.
Yeah. I was gonna go. I think that same route. I would actually probably appeal to what you were saying earlier. Is I think that not every situation is the same, and I think in Christ's situation there was a higher good than self-defense that was going to be obtained for his situation, which is to go to the cross.
Perfect. Let me trace that. Can I trace that?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, when you say higher good, what do you mean? What determines a good? What's a good?
Yeah.
For Christ, it was the ultimate salvation of all of humanity.
Right.
Would it be wrong to say the love of his neighbor?
Is the highest,
or even beyond that, just love as was love the reason that was the higher good? Is that, how do we measure what's good is my question, right?
Yeah, that takes discernment. That's a good question.
Yeah, that is a good question. We're also thinking this through on the fly.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, totally.
Yeah,
I might pivot based off this question,
Yeah, you might
off
have
this
to.
conversation. So.
Yeah, I might have to think about that. Can you maybe state your question one more time, just so
Sure.
I can make
I'll try to make it. I'll try to state it better. So you said
Yeah.
in the case of Christ, the reason that he allowed for himself to not be killed. I'm sorry. He allowed himself to be killed and to not. He didn't defend himself. He went like a lamb to the slaughter. Is because the aim that he had in mind was the redemption of the world, which in his eyes was the greatest of goods. Right? It was a greater good, at least.
And are you saying that applies in every self-defense
No,
scenario?
no, I'm not. I'm just asking you, what would you say the essence of a good is? Like, how do we know? So if I'm confronted with a situation where I'm deciding whether or not to defend myself, how do I know what the greatest good would be?
Yeah.
Well, you have to weigh then the good of the intruder or the good of your family, which is back to your point of
Right.
Yes.
a single versus somebody who's married with kids or something like that.
Well, more vague than that. That's all determinations of love, right?
Sure.
Loving your enemy, loving your family, right? That's the tension that's being drawn there, right? Is two different loves.
And
So
that's-
is love the essence of the good? That's what I'm trying to ask.
I think so.
Is there anything else beyond that? Because
Beyond-
that will paint the rest of the conversation. I think if we can isolate the love as the good, I think that will move us to common ground.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay,
I think
So,
so.
then
If I'm understanding everything properly.
So then the end question of self-defense is what is the loving thing to do?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and you're just
In a vague
that's-
sense, right?
That's why I said it. Yeah, that's why I said it requires discernment,
Right.
Because not every situation is
The factors are always
is equal or the same. So
Sure.
So that's what I said in the beginning.
Yeah.
Is I don't think there should be one rule around it because
yeah, and I think
love
I
is
agree
different.
with you.
Yeah,
perfect.
yeah,
Okay.
right,
Cool.
right, right.
Cool. All right.
I
I just
don't
want to
think
make
I
sure
ever-
we're on the same ground there.
I don't
Yeah,
think I ever disagreed with
I could. Yeah. I guess
Yeah.
you remember.
I think we just use different language in,
Yeah.
in different
Which tends to be the case
Yeah.
with us three.
yeah. So
But it's good.
I
expands
said
different
it
categories.
requires discernment, and I wanted to make the further point is
Yeah.
I think the best way to obtain sound discernment, I guess you could say, is to study the scriptures, to know the scriptures, and to dig deep into the person of Christ and how he's revealed himself.
That
so,
I think
yeah,
is this
for-
particular key.
Yeah. So the distinction that I was going to draw with that is that, in my view, at least as I'm thinking on the fly here, it was better for Christ, and I guess to use your language too, it was better for Christ to forego self-defense for the better purpose of love, which culminates in his death on the cross and resurrection.
Right.
In a more personal scenario amongst us, yeah, it's going to come down to quick thinking and discernment as you see the scenario. And if I'm a single person, somebody breaks into my home, who am I trying to love in that scenario?
That is one of the hardest questions.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
extremely.
And yeah, I don't know that I have a great answer for that, even generally.
I don't know if anybody knows.
Yeah.
Can we say
Okay.
that broadly? This is a hard question.
Let me finish my.
Oh, yeah,
thought
go ahead.
real quick.
Go
And
ahead.
I was gonna say, if you have a family, I think it's probably most of the time going to be my greatest love is owed to my family in that
Mhm.
scenario.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, I think you can build precedence from that with how highly Scripture speaks of family.
Yeah,
in that.
it speaks very. Isn't there a scripture? It might be a psalm. I can't remember, but my buddy quoted it to me the other day. It was. It went something like a man who doesn't provide for
Yes.
his family.
First Timothy.
Yeah.
Second
Yeah,
Timothy.
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah. That's right.
is worse than an
And
unbeliever.
worse than
Right.
Yeah.
infidelity.
So clearly,
Yeah.
the support of the family is biblical
Correct.
and there's precedent for it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so Christ is his situation was a more clear-cut example, I think, of of how love was to be ordered, whereas with us, and that's where I was making the point of being finite and not having an omniscient understanding of circumstances and within the scenario and all of the surrounding factors.
Yeah.
The best we can do is to study the scriptures and know how to react in that situation the best we can.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, it's not it will never be an ideal circumstance, and because we're human beings, we have the capability of being wrong in those scenarios.
Yeah.
Definitely.
So, but we make our decisions hopefully in fear and reverence of God, and that we're trying to order ourselves towards what He would desire for us in that scenario.
Yeah.
So, sorry, what were you going to say before
Oh,
I finished
well,
that point?
It's a tough question, but I was gonna say, is it always, I don't know how to phrase this question well. I think it's something like, is it always a strange witness to the world when Christians choose to love their enemies over their family?
Certainly.
Because I think there are certain instances where
Probably the answer is yes to that.
people's like adherence to their principles of faith
Non-committal.
are yeah, 9 people's adherence to their principles of faith, even despite like the downfall of their family or the sacrifice of themselves and their family, proves an even greater witness of the love of the church to the world. So I think a good example of this, and one that my dad brought up to me at one point when I was trying to determine where I would stand with guns, is he said, well, there was one time where the Amish, who don't, like that, or it was either an Amish community, maybe it was a Mennonite, it was one of those kind of sectarian groups, right, those kind of on their own separatist group, and some shooter went in, killed a bunch of kids in a school that was on their property. And as a group together, they came out and they forgave the person that killed all these people, right? And he said to me, like, I was thinking through, like, issues of conscience and all this kind of stuff, and he was like, and I was basically along the lines of, like, where you're standing. Like, I think it's always our responsibility to protect our family. And my dad said something like, but wow, what a witness to the church, right? And had they been locked and loaded and ready at any moment for an intruder, and had they, been higher in their protective tendencies, right? That they probably would have shot the guy when he came in, but they didn't. And there were witnesses of, like, the kids in the school, and this is really grotesque, but it's also incredibly beautiful, were volunteering to get shot before the other ones. Imagine kids, right? Volunteering themselves as the first to go. That I think is, if the world wants, if we want the world to have some witness of the love of Christ in the church, wow, right?
Well, that's quite a powerful example, but I don't know if I'm on board with what you're saying. If I'm,
and that's fine. I just bring it up as a
I don't think we should
pushback.
I don't think the church should be. Well, maybe this isn't the right way of putting it, but I'll say it this way anyways.
Sure.
I don't think the church should be seeking evil circumstances in order to create a greater witness for itself.
We don't have to seek them; they just come.
Which I figured you would say, but like, the question is like, were the Amish, like, right in how they portrayed that situation, in the fact that they don't do self-defense, they didn't defend themselves.
Well, ultimately, if we wanted to parse that out even more, we could ask a really big question of, well, what's our ultimate aim on this earth? Are we ultimately shooting for the is the church's purpose to bring more good into the world, or so it's postmodern versus pre-modernism, or do we believe that Christ will come at the when there are no believers in the world, or do we believe that Christ will come when the only thing left to be conquered is death?
Oh, you mean a pre or post millennial?
Thank you.
Yeah. No, I see what you're saying. Yeah. No,
Pre or post millennialism.
Yeah.
So that's a bigger question too. It's like,
that's interesting.
I'm all millennial. I think there's. Yeah. No, I think we are going to continue to be harassed and persecuted until the very end. And I think maybe there will be a ramp up near the end, but I'm not sure there
will
will
say
be.
that too, though.
Was that?
The Post Mill will say that too, though.
Not all of them, right? Like
Not all of them,
there's
but-
some post mills that
Yeah,
will
they're
say
just
it
gonna
just
say-
gets better and better, and then Christ comes back, right?
Yeah, but there will still be a small minority by the end
sure.
of things that are still going to harass and
Sure. I don't think that persecution is ever going to go extinct in the church. Does that help
Yeah.
solidify? So, in that sense, that actually, just from this conversation, I feel like I'm actually becoming more entrenched in the pacifist. Just thinking through, like, if the real essence of the church and like what we're aiming for is witnessing to Christ's love and trying to embody that same self-sacrificial love that that Christ showed to us, to the world, right? That forgives the world even as it crucifies it, right? I think it's more gray, it's blurry, right? The ties between family and enemy are pulled in that, but like at least in the instance of my wife, like I know where she's going, right? And I'm not married, so I don't have a wife, but like in most cases we know where our family is headed. We know where,
I think it's a great witness. I don't think that we necessarily have to open ourselves up to that.
And I wouldn't say it's mandated, right? But if we are choosing between the greater of witnesses, right? If we're choosing between which brings more glory to the name of Christ.
If you're
I
still
don't know,
around,
man.
if you're
I
still
lean
around
toward
in order to witness
the love of neighbor or of enemy.
Well, I mean that's if your torch is snuffed and you have no way of actually like essentially what I'm trying to say is if you're not able to get that message out because you're not around, is that witness even effective?
I think it's the most effective when it ends in your death, because I think that is it's the punctuation mark that leads to no debate.
But would you being killed in your home lead to that testimony?
I think among those who knew you. But regardless of that, even if we're not witnessing specifically to the world, because that's a good question. If there's no one around to hear it, if a tree falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it, does it make a sound, right? But we also we play to some degree to an audience of the world, but our clearest and truest audience is Christ, and he's our primary audience, right? And we only have an audience in the world because our first audience is Christ. We're trying to be obedient, right? And so I would say, I don't know, man. I do lean towards I think nonviolence will always, because here's the thing. Almost every ethical system will permit something like self-defense. So the one that doesn't, and specifically for the sake of loving the neighbor, loving the enemy, that's such a counter-cultural, that's such an against the world way of thinking, right? Whereas the world would be like, of course kill the guy because of your family, right?
Sure.
But man, imagine
That's
the
the
confidence
easy
that you have in the love of God. If you're willing to even let your family... This is my cousin, who I have had on my other podcast, on the main Sophomoros. I've interviewed him a couple times. He actually got me thinking this way at one point, where I was like, in the case of your family, if you have a family, you're probably justified in self-defense. And he would say, would you not trust God with your family? And I was like, what? And he was like, do you believe that, so let's say you're like, if your family is believing, right? And you allow the intruder to be killed, who you don't know where they stand with God, you have decided the day of their judgment, right? Like that was their last moment. And it could be that they go straight to the gates of hell, right? Whereas your family, you're at least as confident as you can be that they're headed where you're headed, right? That they'll be with Christ. So what's lost in the sake of taking the life of an intruder, of the enemy, is any chance of repentance, right? So that's also
and that comes down to all
factor.
variables as well. You know, depending if that, like, you know, even in that alone, it's like if the intruder has heard the gospel and rejected it, or if he has heard it and he's still
But
wrestling with it.
Paul heard it
whatever.
many times, and well, we assume,
Certainly, but
right?
we know that
And
people will
still kill
reject
people.
Christ until their own death. You know, so
Absolutely. But do we want to be the ones that pull that trigger? You know what I mean?
yeah, but even, you know, then you could introduce a different variable, like, well, what if you have a child or daughter who hasn't come to faith?
Absolutely.
And then you are protecting them. And
So
their
the math
ability
just
to
gets
come.
very complicated.
Yeah, the other thing I was going to say too is like your view, although I don't think that you're aiming towards it, seems to put, to use your language from earlier, the weights and measures of glorification of God in man's hand as well. So you've established that it is greater glory to die, to not have arms and just die, because it's a greater glory to God. Whereas, who's to say that self-defense doesn't lead to a greater glorification of God in certain scenarios, given certain variables? And
this is where I would come back to the guiding principle that I think is behind all of this, which goes back to Bonhoeffer, is it's taking on the burden of evil, whether that be guilt or the consequences of evil, right? Death, or pain, suffering, on yourself, so that someone else doesn't have to bear them, right? Or bears less of them, right? Which is basically the very heart of Jesus. It's that vicarious atonement.
Frankly, I'd rather have the weight of the guilt from defending my family that ends in someone's death. I'd rather have that guilt on my conscience than to have that person have the guilt of murdering my family on their conscience.
Oh, there's another interesting factor. Here's a question.
Yeah.
Would you have said, though, that Jesus's disciples were the closest thing to family that he had near the end?
Who is my mother? Who is my father?
He who does the will of my Father, right? So, like, maybe
I guess you could say that, but
even closer than the blood relations, right?
yeah, perhaps.
Definitely eschatologically we are, right? Like, we are the adopted
Those with
children.
high views of Mary are furious, but yeah, sure.
Oh, sure. I have an incredibly high view of Mary, though. I think Mary was a disciple, and that's why I can maintain, right? Like that, her value was not strictly the birth, but her obedience, and her obedience is the essence of. But regardless, okay. So if that's true, why didn't Jesus set up things in a way so that the disciples were not persecuted and killed? Right? Because they, as far as we understand, they all were, except for maybe a couple of them, right?
Sure.
And all were certainly persecuted.
Sure.
And most of them were martyred, right? So they all met the same end as we're postulating our family members, violent pain and death, right?
So therefore, we should let all our families die?
What I'm saying is, if it's a rule that the family, that the let's say the protection of one's family is of high regard, why didn't Christ protect what would have been maybe even nearer to him than his family?
Well, I think he did with his death, and
Right.
they had
protected their eternity
yeah.
versus their.
If we're bringing in eternity, then
his
the question inverts, right? So what I'm saying,
Yeah, I
because this whole argument is about our temporality, right?
Right, but yeah, Christ had an omniscient view of those he was protecting, whereas we don't. Like we are not 100% certain that our family members are going to enter the gates of heaven. Does that make sense?
And the disciples rejected Christ.
Yeah.
I don't know exactly how that finds its way in, but I do know that that's a relevant detail in that.
You mean them leaving him on the night of his betrayal?
Well, Peter denial of him 3 times. He had no allies. They all rejected him.
But he didn't. It's not that he didn't protect them because they
No, I'm
fled
saying
from
that.
him.
I don't know how this ties in, but that's what comes to my mind.
Actually, I think it would almost tie into the other end, where it would be like the reason that Peter was wrong was because he did not go to the cross with Jesus, right? The reason that Peter was wrong was because he got afraid and abandoned, rather than So here, I don't know. It's a really tricky question for me, and I don't feel comfortable like going full sail in either direction, but I definitely feel like I lean more towards the pacifist end.
I think I see your sympathies and things, but
I understand it fully. I think and this ties in, I guess, more so to my argument just for firearms in general, is because obviously the moment a firearm goes off is the worst case scenario. So that is what you're hoping it doesn't end in. So owning firearms doesn't mean that you're going to kill somebody, but
No.
it does mean that it is a preventative measure against somebody coming in and committing a horrible act of grotesque sin. And so I guess this is a different point, but my argument for owning firearms is that it is a great level of threat deterrent that doesn't ultimately need to end in someone's death, but and this is my stance, I guess, in the case that person will not stop their attack on my family or whatever, I will have to reconcile with defending myself ultimately, and that'll be on me, and I'll have to wrestle with that,
The consequences of that.
yeah, and whatever that may be. But for me and how I see the importance of family and my role in their lives, I'm more willing to take on that burden than
I appreciate the complexity there.
yeah.
than allowing them to go through something horrible in the hope that may bear witness and ultimate testimony to the love of Christ.
Because what you're witnessing to there is that in every possible scenario involving the active use of a firearm, we're beyond ideals. There is no, and this is where I think Bonhoeffer's approach comes back again, where it's like there is no getting out of this without guilt. So it's either on their hands, or it's on yours, or it's on your family's. It's somewhere. The guilt is going to be somewhere. So
and that's what I see in that situation. Window cracks. I grab the firearm. I meet home invader in living room. Hey man, stop this right now. This doesn't have to end this way. He continues coming. Dude, I'm warning you. Do not come any further.
If you even have the chance.
Exactly.
Right. That's
but it's
pretty
like
reasonable.
Multiple warnings. It's like, and the pursuit is relentless on their end.
Yeah.
At that point, if they're unwilling to yield, and I have offered them the opportunity, which the opportunity to yield is always on their conscience, they don't have to do that. They don't have to invade my home, no matter any circumstance. If that opportunity is presented for them and they do not relinquish, then that's when I will make that decision.
Yeah.
Ultimately.
I think I'm in the same boat as Nate, and to even bolster the case, because you really piqued my interest with the idea of bringing glory to God, even if that means, I guess to use your language, like giving up our possible family's deaths to Him as well.
Right.
But to add to the other side of that, let's say you do defend your family. I think we still have to remember that, there's a great potential that greater glory to God is given because your family survives and has the potential to go out and even use that situation as a means to bring glory to God's name. Because everybody has like
Mhm.
concentric circles of people they're involved with,
Mhm.
and so their continuing to live is, you know, let's say you have 3 kids, it's 3 times than that one individual that survives. If
Yeah, but
that
I
makes
think
sense.
I think the witness immediately gets tainted by the violence. So I think there's
My
a
child's witness gets tainted by my violence.
I think if they try to use it to bring glory, it's like God saved me from this violent intruder because my dad shot him, right? It's like
Well, yeah,
oh,
I mean,
now
you're using
feel
the worst
guilty.
possible interpretation of that event.
Right.
But for example, to Eric's point, it's like if I were to defend my family and my child grows up to be a missionary and presents the gospel and you know to people that need to hear it, then and I'm not trying to bring glory to myself, but it's like in order for that to happen, that scenario needed to have played out
they
the
need
way
to,
that
You're
they
willing
did.
to bear that guilt.
I'm willing to bear that guilt, but also, so in that case of my child being able to use that scenario, imagine my child understanding the complexities of that scenario and then being able to go and love on people that are in prison for
Sure.
home invasion, and they say, you don't have to feel the guilt for this. You know, like being able to witness to them
Yeah.
and present the gospel to them in that manner.
Mhm.
You know, and obviously we can cherry pick scenarios that support our cases in both
Sure.
Yeah.
sides. I think that the deeper point and the point that both of us are getting to is that God can reconcile both good and evil acts. Ultimately, all things will be reconciled to Him.
Yes.
In the end,
Agreed.
all things will be made whole.
So maybe that's not
reconciled
even a
to us.
helpful form of argumentation. Maybe
Yeah.
we just drop that, and
Yeah.
I can back off on that. So,
the only point I was trying to make there is that like it's very subjective as to how glory is being brought to God. Yes, your scenario is seemingly a great, with the example of the Amish
Witness,
people,
yeah.
a great witness to God. I'm just saying like defending your family isn't not a great witness to God potentially speaking at the very least.
yeah. Well, this is all a very I don't know. This is a very it's a good conversation. Let me close by asking maybe one last variant in an area we really haven't explored at all that I think I feel like might be an answer towards something like not an ideal, but at least getting past the dichotomy here. Is there room for Christian creativity around how you stop the intruder?
Like
You know,
Home Alone
you-
style.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, well, sure. But I'm thinking non-lethals, right?
Yeah,
I don't think Nate or I are trying to bind the consciences of individuals and say you must own a gun to defend your family.
No,
Right.
no. But it is the most effective way, essentially.
Absolutely, yeah. At least in today's current time, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. 1,000 years ago, it was a sword.
Yeah. Christ said get a sword. So, yeah.
Justification.
Also, I don't think that verse should be used in support of self-defense. I've heard it used in support of self-defense. It takes it out of context, I think. But
Yeah.
anyways.
I'd have to read it again, but yeah.
Sorry. Go ahead.
Regardless, yeah. Where was I?
for Christian creativity,
Oh, yeah.
could it be that I don't know, what if Christians were the pioneers in certain industries involving non-lethal approaches to self-defense? What if we, really pioneered that?
And that was my thing for a long time. I was like, when I eventually have a concealed carry or whatever, I'll use rubber bullets, which is non-lethal ammunition.
Yeah.
So I have no argument against that.
Yeah.
Other than it's a less effective form of threat detection or threat.
Yeah.
Deterring a threat.
Deterring a threat.
Yeah.
And then you at least can say,
Deterrence.
I tried, let's say the guy gets past you. I tried to deter him and was convinced that I could, right? I could deter him,
Yeah.
right? Because, man, rubber bullets are no joke, right? But
They aren't.
in fact, they can be lethal, depending on where you hit somebody. But anyways,
Right.
I just think, and even beyond that, what if we became the pioneers of that technology? like what a witness. I don't know. Like
Yeah,
I love
definitely.
when Christians can get into things where they almost transcend the debates. You know,
Yeah.
it's like,
And
okay, are you
that'd be
pro-life or are you pro-choice? Well, what if all the Christians just went and adopted the babies, or like, you know, something like, or like offered to adopt, right? Or supported the mothers or something like that. So it's like we're not even trying to get into the arguments,
Right.
and we just go straight into a positive way of approach, right?
Well, then you have what's his name in the orphanages, you know,
Right.
like that.
George Mueller.
George
yeah,
Mueller.
I mean,
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
an
yeah.
amazing witness, you know, of somebody who saw a problem and approached it from a gospel-centered worldview and lived his life in order to meet the needs of the people of that
Yeah.
time, you know, the needs
And
of the children.
You don't get the vibe from Mueller that he was like condemning all the parents that had left their, like, abandoned their children, right?
Not that we know of, at least.
Not that we know of, right? He just inserted himself. There was no judgment. He inserted himself directly into how can I help? How can I sacrifice my own good
Yeah.
for the sake of these, you know, my neighbors, right?
Yeah, and rubber bullets is a great, you know, option for non-lethal
Right.
threat deterrence.
Yeah, if somebody wants to use a
The-
baseball bat because their mind or their conscience won't allow them to get a gun, by all means, use a
Right.
baseball bat. you
Yeah.
know, But
Yeah, the argument on the opposite side would be, well, that's not the most effective threat, or that's not the most effective mode of threat
Yeah.
deterrence, and so then it's like, then the question becomes, did I do everything I could
Right.
in order to protect my family? And then you would say, no, I didn't.
But even if
And-
you
and-
want to follow that line of argumentation,
but that's
you could
the
say,
opposite argument.
Sure. But you could say to somebody who has even a handgun, it's like, well, why don't you put out landmines? You know, that would
I mean,
really
yes.
be much better than right. Like at
I
some
was-
point, it gets absurd.
I
right?
was thinking that I wasn't.
Right,
gonna
but then you
bring
have
it
to weigh you have to weigh
let's
risk
put
over
a
reward.
tank in my
Christian,
house.
yeah, Christian.
Well,
It's just a house.
Right,
Yeah.
and then you have to measure reality against
Exactly.
fictionalization. So
Exactly. Yeah. So I feel like you almost can't follow that all the way.
well, yeah,
You can't follow it the other way
you
either,
can't,
right?
You can't live in a basement, you know, but
This is the thing that I think scares me the most about the church and its attitude towards guns in general, and makes me want to be on the other side of it. Is you do get people in the church who are like gun nuts, and not in the sense of like your grandfather, where it's like, this is my, you know, like this is my hobby. I collect these things. I cherish them because of, you know, the time. It's like. I just got myself an M60 for home defense. It's like, you don't need a light machine gun to defend your home, right? Like, there's a point at which it becomes a shrine of its own, and that's what scares me.
Maybe
Or like
there's-
the
I
prepper
would agree.
mentality.
I would agree.
Maybe there's a day you need an M60. Maybe someday.
One day, Eric, when you're mowing down a whole, you know,
Yeah,
field
well,
full of infidels, right?
I mean, if we're getting into the worst case scenarios,
When
you
the
know,
Nazis come
an
knocking
invading
at the door.
army,
Right.
you know, or a civil war.
Well,
breaks
that's when
out
we
or
get into
whatever.
questions of war, and I don't think we're there yet. Let's
I
not talk
was,
about
I was
that yet.
kidding. Was that?
Yeah. We could talk there. One man army, just
Rambo style.
yeah. You're rigging up a nuke to the top of your house.
Well, now we're just being absurd.
Yeah. But it does, like, do you guys at least agree that in America it can become a cult of its own?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, I was gonna say that's probably more. Your question was more primarily an American issue. I
Yeah,
would
absolutely.
say. I'm not sure anywhere else in the world has
No.
that particular issue to deal with. But
Probably not.
They have their own issues to deal with.
Yeah.
So that's part of why, like, I told you guys, and maybe I will have kept it in because I don't know how much at the beginning I can save, but I'm not convinced that I will have a firearm in my life, and mostly the reason is not because of like the whole self-defense thing, but because I don't know that I want to associate myself with the impulse towards specifically guns as the solution, right? I've just seen so much of that turn into, like, you know, I'm packing at church and like I want to show everybody my gun and like
Oh,
at
sure.
church, right? Like it's crazy, like
Well, yeah.
you know,
Well, yeah, but then
go to
you
a
know,
men's event, everybody's bringing their
Well,
handguns
yeah.
out, and it's like,
And,
what's happening
I mean,
right now?
I've known churches to have men concealed carry on purpose at church in
Oh,
in
that's
order
a
for
question.
threat.
Yeah,
for threat
there's
deterrence.
a question.
So yeah, I mean, there you go. that's-
First church I went to in Kentucky, when we got there, we arrived on a Sunday, and I walked in shorts and a t-shirt into our first service, and yeah, there was an armed guard at the door.
Yeah,
as you walk
we
into
had
the
police
sanctuary.
officers.
What is your initial reaction to that?
My initial reaction
Yeah.
was like, I guess we're really in the South.
Yeah.
No, that's funny.
But like on an ethical level, like where does your heart go with that? Like, does it make you feel like I'm glad? Does it make you feel like this is icky?
I had mixed feelings, to be honest with you, because on the one hand, I'm consistent with my belief for self-defense, and I think, in the same way that we were talking about family, I think the church is extended family as well, and I think there is at the very least possibility that the church enters into persecution again. Is the South there yet?
Yeah.
Probably not.
But even if it entered into it, how much are we to try to escape persecution? Like, to what extent?
Yeah,
At what
that's a
point do
good
we
question.
not?
Right now, I'm operating from a belief that if an armed guard or if a man in a congregation stops a mass shooter from mowing down an entire church, I'm operating from the belief that that's a good thing.
Which does seem to be a problem in America today as well. You can't really deny that that there is mass shooting issues that we have to deal with.
But
Which is not even from a persecution basis.
Yeah.
Sure, but put the whole thing into equation. So it's not just if a man in a church who's concealed carrying stops a mass shooting. It's if a man in a church kills another man who comes into the church to commit a mass shooting. Right? Like, I think we oftentimes try to sanitize the way that we approach. It's not just stops. It stops with lethal force, right? It stops with the same force that's being brought into the church.
Right.
Right.
So your problem isn't with self-defense, because of that, if the man in the congregation has rubber bullets and the person is not killed, you don't have a problem with that.
No.
Okay, so the problem is with the lethality of it.
Yes. And the witness that has for the church in general, right? Like what that says about the church, right?
Yeah.
Well, the church is they're in a lose-lose situation with that anyways, because if
totally, absolutely,
if you don't
we said, there's no ideals here,
if
right?
if you don't use lethality and you don't stop the shooter, then the church is going to be shamed for not
protecting its
right.
people.
Why didn't you protect its people? And then ultimately, we know that persecution will continue.
So
I don't know where I stand on this one
at the
either.
end of the day, wouldn't it be better that people didn't die and just take the criticism?
One person dies. That's what that's what I'm trying to maintain here, is that there is no deathless end, right?
Yeah.
In this conversation, at least right now,
I think it is. And man, maybe it's just a weird sensitive bias, but I feel like if I am choosing between the death of one person who's a believer and one person who's not a believer, I want to choose the death of the believer because, again, we know where they're headed. Now, if you then line that up and say, but is 30 believers' death worth one unbeliever's
the opposite
death?
of the trolley problem.
Right. Well, it's like just a more complex version, yeah.
Well, yeah. So it's a trolley problem, but you're weighing one unbelieving person versus however many believing persons.
Right.
And it sounds like
at what point does it cross the level? I don't know.
It sounds like what you're saying is that there's no number of believers that justifies the killing of the unbeliever. That's what it sounds.
I don't feel like that's right either.
Well, that's what I'm saying too.
But I think that the number is higher than, like, I will lean towards the believers.
Yeah. How does
taking that? Yeah.
Is it Sodom and Gomorrah? Is that the one?
Oh yeah, the 5. Yeah, if there are 5 righteous, or there's 50 righteous, or that whole thing.
Yeah, I don't want to. Yeah, I think that might come into play, but
interesting.
I think we should probably end, and I kind of want to end with my gag question.
All right, go ahead.
From the beginning,
yeah.
Which was, should Christians own guns whatsoever, even if it's just to hunt animals and provide for the family?
I certainly wouldn't make any law against it. I think it's a matter of conscience.
Sure. Yep.
Yeah.
I can agree with that.
And Nate gave it a thumbs up.
Yeah. I think we answered that along the way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, friends, thanks for joining us on this week's episode of the Triclinium. This is a long one. This will probably be like an hour and 40 minutes when it's done.
Yeah, probably.
Maybe even more.
But this was a great conversation.
Oh my gosh, yeah, this is a great one. This is what you get when we're all together.
Yeah, seriously.
If you have any questions for us, go ahead and email us at sophomorosofficial@gmail.com, SOPHOMOROS official@gmail.com, and we'd love to get back to you. And as always, may Christ be exalted.